Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight as we confer the award of Fellow for the Association, the award of Fellow of the Association for Art History for this year's recipients. I'm Greg Perry. I'm the CEO of the Association. And on behalf of our board and our staff, I'd like to welcome you to our event tonight, where we will recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of 4 people who have made significant contributions to our field. This is the 3rd year of our annual Fellows program, and we're so pleased to bring together in one evening this group of most accomplished colleagues in our field, and we are glad that you can participate with us tonight. Our Fellows were nominated by members of the association. Those nominations were considered by a panel of respected colleagues from around the UK, and then these are confirmed by our Board of Trustees. So a number of the Fellows' peers have been involved in helping to recognize their achievements, and we're grateful for all of those who participated in this process with the association. In future, all being well, we hope to be able to confer these awards in person at our annual conference. But for the time being, we thought it more prudent and practical to do this online. So with tonight's virtual event, we are formally conferring the honor of Fellow of the Association for Art History to our esteemed colleagues. And they are Dawn Addis, Professor Emerita of the History and Theory of Art at the University of Essex; Lynda Nead, Pevsner Professor of History of Art at Birkbeck, University of London; Stephen Nelson, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art; and Lisa Tickner, Emeritus Professor of Art History at Middlesex University and Honorary Professor at the Courtauld Institute. We extend our congratulations and great appreciation to each of our fellows for their extraordinary bodies of work and their dedication to advancing our subject through their own scholarship and through their work with students. So tonight, each of our fellows will be introduced in turn by a different person, those who have been associated with their work or have been influenced by it or found it particularly important in their own careers. Dawn Addis will be introduced by Krzysztof Fiolkowski, Professor of Visual Culture and Senior Lecturer at Norwich University of the Arts. Lynda Nead will be introduced by Patrizia Di Bello, Professor of History and Theory of Photography at Birkbeck. Stephen Nelson will be introduced by Lucy Bradnock, Associate Professor of Art History at Nottingham University and incoming editor of our journal, Art History. And Lisa Tickner will be introduced by Sarah Victoria Turner, Deputy Director at the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. And with that, I'll hand it over to Krzysztof to introduce Dawn Addis.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks, everybody. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to have been asked to introduce Dawn Addis for the Association for Art History's Fellowship Awards this evening. And it's a mark of Dawn's reputation that I can think of dozens of other people who'd have been delighted to do this in my place. Dawn is Professor Emerita of History and Theory of Art at the University of Essex, where she taught from 1968 to 2008, including a period as head of her department. Since winding down her teaching commitments, we can hardly call this a retirement, she's continued to supervise PhD students at the university. To quote the announcement for today's ceremony, with its impressive list of achievements, Dawn is Professor of the History of Art at the Royal Academy, a former trustee of Tate, the National Gallery, Henry Moore Foundation and Freud Museum, and currently trustee of the Elephant Trust and the Esterick Collection. She's a fellow of the British Academy and was honoured first in 2002 with an OBE, then again in 2013 with a CBE for services to higher education. An important reason why this fellowship is so richly deserved is the noticeable way in which Dawn's work as an educator, scholar and curator have been so intertwined. Between these 3 roles, her work, energy and love of her subjects will have brought her into contact with so many people and places, perhaps most of all in her work as a curator and co-curator of major exhibitions, as well as contributor to their catalogues, that together will have had an impact on literally hundreds of thousands of visitors to leading museums and galleries around the world over more than 4 decades. Just listing all of these might take up most of my allotted 5 minutes, but we can pick on a few as a reminder. Dada and Surrealism reviewed at the Hayward Gallery in 1978, Art in Latin America, again at the Hayward, Modena Museet and Reina Sofia in 1989, Dali's Optical Illusions at the Smithsonian in 2000, Salvador Dali's Centenary exhibition at the Palazzo Grassi and Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2004, The Colour of My Dreams, the Surrealist Revolution in Art at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2011, and more recently, Dali Duchamp at the Royal Academy in 2017. It was Dawn's crucial role in the first of these, as part of a team who put together Dada and Surrealism Reviewed at the Hayward, that epitomises the impact of Dawn's scholarship and knowledge, not only for gallery audiences, but for art historians worldwide ever since. The exhibition and catalogue played a huge role in bringing the significance of Dada and Surrealism to prominence at a time when these movements were widely seen as lacking in relevance or gravitas. Together, they set a benchmark for so many subsequent projects, framing these movements in an expanded and global context with a generous timeframe that brought out their full relevance to contemporary audiences. And ever since, it's been above all Dawn's leading role in expanding and promoting the study of surrealism that's in evidence with her writings, exhibitions, and rigorous research, a field that, as we know, is now seen as central to so many debates and disciplines in modern and contemporary creative arts. What's often characterized Dawn's contribution is her enthusiasm for crossing disciplinary boundaries. Perhaps that's a legacy of her having come to art history from an initial literature background, and exploring apparently marginal topics. While a key contribution to Dada and Surrealism Reviewed was her interest in avant-garde journals, her 1976 book, Photomontage, helped shape the way in which collage and photography would eventually be seen as central to modern and contemporary art. Among the directions in which her research helped to expand the conversation, we can also think of her commitment to Latin American art, almost completely neglected by UK institutions at the time, including helping to found the Escala collection of Latin American art at the University of Essex. Behind all of this is the tremendous reach and accessibility of her work. As someone who teaches in an art and design background, I can vouch personally for the way in which she continues to have real resonance with young and early career artists. And indeed, her insistence on seeing a living connection between the history of art and contemporary practice has been a feature of many of her projects. Her role in initiatives such as the AHRC Centre for the Study of Surrealism and its Legacies in the early 2000s was crucial in bringing scholars together, expanding fields and connecting disciplines, setting out networks that have continued to grow ever since. Behind this, her commitment to teaching generations of undergraduates and especially postgraduate research students has in effect created an extended family of scholars and curators who develop a field her career has helped to shape. This, like all aspects of her work, has been accompanied with a great generosity and openness, always particularly supportive and encouraging to younger scholars, as I can attest myself from my first meeting with her as an inexperienced PhD student some 35 years ago. Finally, I've got to acknowledge, and with considerable envy on my own part, Dawn's seemingly endless energy and enthusiasm, maintaining a non-stop workload of wonderful projects that seems in no danger of abating. Dawn, long may it last, and so many congratulations on this richly deserved fellowship. Dawn, over to you.
Thank you so much, Christoph. I'm extremely moved by that and very, very grateful. And I'm also hugely honoured and indeed very surprised to have been awarded this, this fellowship. So thank you to the Association of Art Historians. Have I done the right thing? Video? Yes. Okay, I'm going to begin quite early in my career. I hesitated between applying to art school or to university, eventually opting for the latter to read English. And it was only towards the end of my time at Oxford that a light came on and I realised how I might actually have a career involving pictures. The prompt was the lectures delivered in 1964 by Edgar Vint, Slade Professor of the History of Art, on the Renaissance. And the one I remember particularly was on Michelangelo and Savonarola. I was fascinated by the relationships between ideas and images. Vint didn't take students and pointed me to the Courtauld, where I started my MA looking at 18th century satire in its verbal and visual forms, but ended up 2 centuries later in Dada and Surrealism. My MA thesis was on Pan's art as artist and poet. The exhibition Dada and Surrealism Reviewed that Christoph mentioned in 1978 swallowed up what would have been my PhD on the relationship between word and image in the Dada and Surrealist journals. This initial interest has never faded, and more recently has been fueled by the works of women artists in the Surrealist orbit, who wrote as well as painted. Leonora Carrington, for example, Unica Zorn, Claude Cahun, or Alice Parlin Raon. I wrote an essay for Whitney Chadwick's exhibition, Mirror Images, Women, Surrealism and Self-Representation, 1998, which took its title, Orbits of the Savage Moon, from a poem by Joyce Mansour. The essay's subtitle was Surrealism and the Representation of the Female Subject in Mexico and Post-War Paris. One of the artists I discussed was Maria Izquierdo, who was the first woman in 20th century Mexico to sustain a successful professional career as a painter. It's been really satisfying to see her work, two enigmatic, powerful and combative paintings in the current exhibition at Tate, Surrealism Beyond Borders. And I'm hoping for a full-scale retrospective of Maria Izquierdo sometime soon. Now, making exhibitions has been a great pleasure, especially those involving joint curating, not those with former students, about which I'll talk in a moment. And I think particularly of Salvador Dali, A Mythology with Fiona Bradley at Tate Liverpool in 1998, two exhibitions with Simon Baker, Undercover Surrealism, Georges Bataille Document at the Hayward in 2006, and Close Up, Proximity and Defamiliarization in Art, Film and Photography at Fiona Bradley's Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh in 2008. And finally, Art in Latin America, which Christoph has already mentioned, with Guy Brett and Andrew Dempsey. I'm going back to another beginning for a moment. I was fortunate to join the Department of Art at Essex University, later called the Department of the History and Theory of Art, in 1968, shortly after it was founded. It was an extremely exciting time, pioneering different approaches to art and radical developments in aesthetics and theory, while emphasizing the importance of the object itself. There was also at Essex a School of Latin American Studies. And because I had Spanish and had been to Mexico, I was entrusted with developing courses on Latin American art. I've been trying to remember why I opted for Spanish at school. It was partly because of the poet Federico Garcia Lorca, whom I wanted to read in the original, but more because I thought Latin America was the land of the future, and I might perhaps start an import-export company dealing in fruit. Remember, this was the 50s when there wasn't much fruit, which would have led to a rather different life. Now, creating courses on Latin American art in the 60s and 70s was quite testing because there was precious little literature and no Google to find images. I built up a slide library with field trips to Mexico and South America to cover everything from pre-Columbian architecture and art through the colonial period to the present day. That the whole project didn't collapse was largely thanks to the students. It was genuinely a team effort. And the impossible ambition to cover the history of a continent became more possible thanks to those who joined in the course, who went on to do their own extremely diverse original research, and in some cases became colleagues. My friend and former colleague, former in that we are now both retired, Valerie Fraser, who was my first PhD student. Valerie walked through the Andes to record and analyze the extremely remote 16th century churches built after the conquest. While individual research remained the core of our activities at Essex, joint research projects and collaborations of various kinds helped expand the field, encouraged the exchange of ideas, and created a network of contacts with Latin America. The postgraduate world opened up with MAs and then with people coming from all over the world to do PhDs. Our engagement with contemporary art in Latin America was hugely boosted when two postgraduate students took steps to create a collection at the university. Charles Cossack and Gabriel Perez Barrero pointed out that, especially given our emphasis at Essex on studying the real object, it was ridiculous that there was virtually no Latin American art to see in this country. And they argued that we should start immediately making contact with artists. So our collection of Latin American art, now known as Escala, was launched in 1993. It's thriving and now contains over 800 works. I was going to talk about my views of the necessary reciprocity between teaching and research, but I'll let that comment just stand and carry on. I take great pride in the achievements of those who studied with me, who, despite my multiple shortcomings as a PhD supervisor, have succeeded not only in getting their PhDs, but in pursuing their research and developing terrific careers, whether in the context of museums or universities or independently, in this country and across the globe. I draw regularly on their work, that, for example, of David Hopkins in Glasgow, Michael White in York, Neil Cox now at the Leonard Lauder Centre in New York, Adina Kamian at the Israel Museum, Rihanna Badley at the University of the Arts here in London, Cuauhtemoc Medina at UNAM in Mexico City, Maria Clara Bernal in Bogota, and many others. I've also enjoyed collaborations, for example, on exhibitions. And again, I'll just name a few, with Elliot King on the Dali retrospective at the Palazzo Grassi in 2004, with Marco Daniel in Art and Power, Europe Under the Dictators in 2006, Matthew Gale in Dali on Film in 2007, David Lomas, The Narcissus Reflected at the Fruit Market Gallery in 2011, with William Jeffett for Dali Duchamp at the RA in 2017. Cuauhtemoc Medina invited me to curate the historical section of Manifesta 9 in 2012. His exhibition, The Deep of the Modern, on mines, mining and modernism at the mine in Genk, Belgium, has become a topic of research in its own right. This project took me back to my earliest research on the 18th century and the picturesque. And we also had great fun recreating Marcel Duchamp's coal sack ceiling in the heart of the old mine. Well, forgive me, I can't name everyone, but I'm very grateful to the Association of Art Historians for giving me this opportunity to reflect on my work and to thank those who have so greatly contributed to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here on such a wonderful evening, or at least it is a wonderful evening here in London. I'm very honoured and also a little emotional to be introducing Nead this evening. I first met her in 1989 when I was a part-time MA student and a struggling photographer. And I still remember the first time she smiled at me and told me, "I like your essay." She was the one lecturer we all looked up to, and her positive comments and incredibly thorough feedback to our essays was much treasured. Lynn was the one who suggested I should do a PhD, and I never regretted turning down scholarships from 2 other places to have her as my supervisor. She literally changed my life, and I will be forever grateful to her. So, Lynda Nead, Pevsner Professor of History of Art at Birkbeck College, is an art historian, curator and broadcaster whose work on British art and culture has had an immense impact on academia and beyond in many ways. I've especially always been in awe of and have tried to learn from the ways in which she has not only expanded the discipline into others, but digested other fields and practices to nourish art history. From feminism and social history in too many books and articles to mention here, to boxing and blondness. And this is in a current project, which is a book titled British Blonde, Gender, Sexuality and Desire in Post-War Britain. From law and film to photography and the press, for example, in The Tiger in the Smoke, Art and Culture in Post-War Britain, her book of 2017, and to the circulation of filth as waste in sewers and as pornography in print shops, in a book on Victorian Babylon, People, Street and Images in 19th century London. Her groundbreaking work on the nude has become required reading on all good art history programs. It connects sexuality and power in ways that students still find inspiring and relevant to the present, for its insight into the power of images to shape and reinforce the too often unequal positions of women and men in relation to these terms. The exhibition she curated at the Foundling Museum in 2016, The Fallen Woman, moved me to tears. I was properly sobbing. For the ways in which it gave a voice to the women who had to abandon their children at the Foundling Hospital, and for the ways in which she made this understand as an ultimate act of care. It was also a beautiful show, juxtaposing grand Victorian paintings with the small, humble objects left by mothers as a token of love and as a form of identification, in the hope they might one day be reunited with their children. Lynn Nead's work is always marked by a unique way of creating a productive tension between characteristics often thought of as opposite, elegance and effect, canonical works of art, and everyday or seemingly banal practices, beautiful lucid prose. And I partly mentioned that some of the titles of the books, I mean, I know you can always go and look her up and find them on Google, but I mentioned them because even the titles give you a flavor of how well she writes. So beautiful lucid prose, but sometimes applied to messy, mucky or foggy topics, making productive connections between multisensorial aesthetics and social history that illuminate afresh the past and the present. Lynn's work has always been a driving force in establishing the History of Art department at Birkbeck as one of the best in the UK, as has a commitment to reach audiences beyond academia through her work as a broadcaster, for example, for the BBC, as a curator, as I've already mentioned, as an advisor to institutions such as the Museum of London, and more recently as a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Lynn has been an inspiring teacher and supportive mentor to many of her students, Carol Jacobi, Jane Rendell, and Michael Hatt amongst them. She is a wonderful person to work with, and I feel very privileged to count her as one of my colleagues and a friend, and to congratulate her for this well-deserved fellowship. Over to you, Lynn.
Oh, Patricia, thank you for such a lovely and generous introduction. And it's been such a pleasure working with you as a colleague, but I mean, primarily as a friend. So thank you for that. I want to begin by saying that it's such an honor to be made a fellow of the Association for Art History and to be in the company of others, both this year and in previous years, whose work and whose friendship has been of such importance to me during my career. History of art has been a love and a constant presence in my adult life. Like many of my generation, I wasn't able to study A-level art history at school, and so a brilliant art teacher spent her lunchtimes with a couple of us discussing postcards bought from the National Gallery. I originally applied to study English and history of art at university and ended up at the University of Leeds doing a combined degree in history of art in the fine art department and history of the decorative arts, which was taught at Temple Newsome House and Leeds City Art Galleries. Now, I don't make a habit of thinking back over my education and professional career. Doing that for this acceptance talk, however, made me realize how everything since my undergraduate degree has accrued and, yes, to extend the metaphor, yielded benefits. Although the decorative arts at that time were dominated by connoisseurship and style histories, I'm sure that my interest in marginal, non-fine art objects and material culture stemmed from this time. And how to convey the excitement of being taught as an undergraduate by Griselda Pollock and Tim Clark, to study Van Gogh with Griselda and attend lectures on Impressionism and modernity by Tim. I believe that that was a special moment in the history of art history in Britain, although I would suggest that the present moment is also one of huge significance to the discipline. I did my PhD with Will Vaughan at University College London. In fact, Lisa Tickner was my external examiner. There I was researching representations of femininity in Victorian art and began teaching as a postgraduate. I realized how fortunate I was to be able to move so seamlessly through my funded education and on to employment. And in more recent years, I've worked with the Leverhulme Trust, Birkbeck, and the Paul Mellon Centre Advisory Board to support the work of early career researchers. It is a difficult time for those scholars now, and they need support. There are three themes, I think, that run through my work in art history: interdisciplinarity, intermediality, and social mobility. I found our discipline to be an incredibly enabling and generous one. It provides a home for different objects of study and methodologies, and much of my work has been about testing the boundaries of the discipline and finding new relationships between art history and neighboring and not so neighboring disciplines. Throughout my art history career, from an undergraduate through to doctoral research, and now, I have gone to reading groups, short courses, and film societies. And in the last 2 years alone, I've attended a course on film noir and on comedy and psychoanalysis. And I always tell my students to do the same. Open yourself up, think widely as an art historian. I've always believed that the more influences and ideas that you open yourself up to, the greater the possible connections and interpretations you can bring to your subject of study. For me, like Dawn, the image or the object is always at the very center or core of my art historical practice, but I will bring to it as wide a range of contexts and networks as possible in order to understand that object and image and the ways that it makes meaning. After temporary jobs at the University of Leicester and the University of Kent, and I want to say what a wonderful environment Kent was at that time in the late 1980s, with its wonderful women's studies department and film department, and also with Stephen Bann in history of art there. After those jobs, I was appointed to a permanent position at Birkbeck in the University of London, and that's where I've spent most of my career. In the years that I've been at Birkbeck, it's grown from a department of 6 people when I joined to a group of 18 art historians in a subject area that is joined by academics in film, media, and cultural studies. Based in Bloomsbury, Birkbeck has proved to be as accommodating and enabling a place for my work as the discipline itself has been. Most importantly, however, Birkbeck specialises in providing University of London degrees to working people. So most of the teaching is in the evening, and the students are characteristically those that missed out on study immediately after school and are doing their degrees a few years later. Art history has a problem with its demographics. The historical relationship of art, power, and class has proved itself to be incredibly resilient, and we still need to challenge this. We still have to convince students, all kinds of students from all kinds of backgrounds, about the relevance of the subject and its transferable skills. And this isn't a fabrication, it's true, but we need to do a better job at publicizing this. And in the current context of government defunding of the arts and humanities, this is more urgent than ever. Birkbeck is a small institution compared to some of the giants in the University of London, but this has allowed connections between disciplines that in bigger universities are harder to make. In the early years of Birkbeck's law school, I collaborated with the fantastic legal theorists and historians Peter Goodrich and Kostas Douzinas on a conference at Tate called Law and the Image, which later became a book, one of the first studies of the relationship between these two disciplines. As head of department, I was able to oversee the appointment of Laura Mulvey and Ian Christie as professors of film in an expanded Department of History of Art and Screen Media. And working across visual media remains one of the most important aspects of my ongoing research on post-war Britain. And in more recent years, I've continued these interdisciplinary and intermedial collaborations, working with Professors Katie Grant and John Wyver in order to explore film as a research method, using the essay film or videographic essay as a way of exploring historical and visual questions. These collaborations and others have been of incredible importance to me. Collaborative research isn't necessarily easier or quicker, but it is so stimulating to see how different disciplines fit, or indeed fail to fit, how they connect or fail to. I've just finished being an assessor on the REF 2021 Art and Design sub-panel. And it strikes me that there is a real paradox between the vivacity of the discipline and its incredible research and its precarious position within the academy. This makes the role of the Association for Art History even more important. And as a fellow, I will also do my best to be an advocate and supporter of this brilliant subject. Thanks a lot.
Good evening, everybody. It's my honour and my immense joy to introduce to you Stephen Nelson. Steve is an internationally recognised scholar of contemporary and historic African and African diasporic art and architecture, African American art history, and queer studies. He's currently Dean of the Centre for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, CASVA, at the National Gallery of Art, Washington, DC. I've not had the pleasure of working directly with Steve, but I have long been an admirer of him and his work, and we have some collaborators in common, which is a joy to me. In fact, I first encountered Steve by reputation when I arrived at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles nearly a decade and a half ago, while he was Professor of African and African American Art History at UCLA, where he was also Director of the UCLA African Studies Center. The reverence and affection with which Steve's name was uttered by colleagues at the Getty made it immediately and abundantly clear, not only that he was an extremely impressive scholar whose work genuinely expanded the boundaries of art history, but also that he was genuinely considered a valuable friend and interlocutor by all who came into contact with him. It's no exaggeration to say that Steve's work has been key in defining the fields of African and African American art history. His scholarship has been groundbreaking in proposing an art history that is as deeply critical and reflective as it is expansive. His work has spanned art, architecture, urbanism, visual culture, and film, always driven by a profound attentiveness to the geographies and the histories of sexuality, race, coloniality, nationhood, and the entanglement of all of these. His intellectual work ranges across continents and chronologies, really impressively drawing out local, national, transcontinental, and colonial histories and visual regimes, whether via his examination of the Muskum domed houses of his multi-award-winning book From Cameroon to Paris, Muskum Architecture in and Out of Africa, published in 2007, or his analysis more recently of a French 19th century colonial map in a recent volume he co-edited entitled Visualizing Empire, Africa, Europe, and the Politics of Representation from 2021, or the popular visual corpus of images of Nelson Mandela, or Sex and Censorship via Musical Film in Post-Colonial Senegal, not to mention his extensive and ongoing and generous engagement and dialogue with the work of contemporary artists. So Steve's research ranges very broadly indeed, but whatever Steve turns his attention to is profoundly illuminated by virtue of his ability somehow to get at the heart of the cultural, historical, and political stakes that it engenders, while retaining a real sense of the particular material and visual coordinates that objects and images inhabit. And that sense of integrity towards his subjects, whether that subject is a person or a community or an object or an image, runs throughout his scholarship. Steve's work is in many ways a masterclass in interdisciplinary and transhistorical thinking, and in his ability to articulate the politics and the positionalities of coloniality with nuance and with that integrity to the voice of his subjects. Steve's work has long been a hugely significant beacon for decolonial approaches to art history. But Steve is more than just a leading scholar in his field, and indeed in the discipline as a whole, as if that weren't enough. He has also forged a significant practice supporting and shaping a generation of art historians, not least in the very many significant leadership positions that he's held at UCLA and at CASVA, as trustee of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and as president of the Arts Council of the African American Studies Association, the African Studies Association until 2012, or Getty Consortium Scholar in 2011-12. And Steve's CV boasts many other such appointments. I mention the Getty Consortium Scholar because that scholar is chosen for their generosity towards a younger generation of researchers. Steve is generous with his time and his energy. He is imaginative in his work and in his ability to reach across art history, practice, curating, writing, always sensitive to the ways in which the work and nature of scholarship shifts across these intellectual, cultural, and institutional boundaries. And he spoke very compellingly of this in a recent public lecture last autumn at Bard, where he reflected on that shift in the context from academy to museum following his own professional trajectory in a really powerful way. In short, Steve exemplifies the kind of research and scholarly practice and leadership that we should all admire and aspire to. He is energetic, enthusiastic, collaborative, reflective, and generous. And as such, he is an ideal recipient of this Association for Art History Fellowship. Steve, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that, that wonderful introduction. And I'm reminded of what my boss, Kaywin Feldman, said when I was hired at the National Gallery. She said, people are going to say really great things about you and it will feel like you're hearing your own obituary. And but this was really generous. And as you spoke, I had really wonderful flashbacks to seeing you at the Getty when you were working on the Lawrence Alloway volume with Rebecca Peabody and a bunch of other people, and Pacific Standard Time as well. And it was great sort of meeting you and communing with you out there. And it's great to see you all here. I also want to thank Gregory Perry and Alan Kerwin and the Association of Art Historians for this honor. It is, I am blown away and I'm surprised. And it's wonderful to be in this company of esteemed colleagues, many of whose work has been profoundly influential in my own trajectory and my own coming into art history, which was not a direct route, as both Don and Lynda so beautifully articulated. I feel like I came into art history through the back door. And that was, as an undergraduate at Yale University, where I studied studio art. I was studying graphic design and I was studying photography. And they forced us, as part of the curriculum, you had to take 3 courses in art history. And I had never, ever even thought about the discipline. And I wound up in a course in Japanese art history, medieval Japanese art history, with a woman named Carolyn Wheelwright. And I fell in love with the subject matter, did spectacularly badly on the essays and the tests, but I stayed. And and I kept taking more art history classes in college in any field I could imagine. So in modern art, in Japanese art, in African art, and so forth, and then immediately left for a career in graphic design. And I stayed in that career for about 7 years before hanging out with a group of graduate students from the University of Pennsylvania, a group of art history graduate students. And they convinced me to come back. And I came back and started working on a PhD in modern art history at Harvard in the early 1990s. And I found over time that my interest really revolved around bringing together an art object and life, and in a way that wasn't necessarily a social art history, though I'd been reading a lot of it, but in a way that sort of brought together sort of art, life, critical theory, activism, working in the world, and love. And I didn't realize, I can say that now, but I didn't know that then. And when I came into African art, and I came in through the back door, I took a class. It was like as an undergraduate, I was taking classes in lots of different fields. And I took a class in medieval Islamic art and started working on a palace, a 14th century palace off the coast of East Africa called Hussein Kubwa. And I was given a grant to go there. And in 1993, and I'd never been over the Atlantic. I'd never been to Europe. I had never been to Africa. And I stopped in London on my way and did some research in London, went down to Tanzania, stayed there for a few weeks and came back. And and at that time, Harvard was hiring the Africanist Suzanne Blier. And so I shifted gears, restarted as an Africanist. And Suzanne became my mentor and my advisor. And from the get-go, what interested me, and I don't know if it's because I'm a diasporic subject, I don't know why, probably why. I was always interested in the relationship of things African to the wider world. And those interests and my background in modern and contemporary art brought me into the study of modern and contemporary African art and architecture. And for me, the Muskam fit in beautifully. It was this wonderful structure that I could look at from a whole number of different contexts. So within its representation in Europe, in situ in Cameroon, as a mark of heritage. And so all of these things, and it really came down to following the object. And that, for me, not unlike what Don and Lynda were talking about, that object was at the center of the inquiry. I very quickly got to a place where I didn't worry about where the object was going to take me. So if it was somewhere art historical, that was great. If it was somewhere not art historical, I was okay with that, which probably says a lot about my conflicted relationship to the field. And not that I don't like the field, but it is that, I think, as Lynda so beautifully talked about, its aura. I'm going to call it its aura. And it's sort of demographics that are really, really, really hard to shift. And I felt like that, in terms of research, that was part of the goal, the disciplinary goal, but also not constraining the object within the discipline. That objects do so many things in the world, and I wanted to follow that, and the Muskam Project was a chance to do it. And I also think, being at UCLA was a chance to do it, and it was, I had moved there to Los Angeles from Boston. I had been at Tufts after graduate school for a couple of years, and I moved to Los Angeles, which was kind of a wonderful, crazy place to be an academic. And people will talk with you about the cliches of California. You go to California, you remake yourself. You go to California and you remake yourself. And I did that as an academic. And so there was something about being in that space at that moment in this department of art history that prided itself on being a kind of un-art historical art history department. And I think that that was true. And I felt like intellectually being in that department and being at UCLA and working in the spaces of connection between art history and African studies and African American studies and queer studies really blossomed for me there. And through that, and through working with students, and not just PhD students, and they've been wonderful, and I'm really thrilled and proud of them, but also undergraduates. I think that we don't say enough about that. That I was able to take my work and my worldview in directions that would never have happened otherwise. And I think that it was all of that, and also the administrative work that led to my coming to the gallery. And so I came here in 2018 as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor, and that's a 2-year post. And I had fully expected to come here, do research for a while, and go back to LA and sort of live out my life, do my work, and teach. And what I realized was that this is a place where there's the platform and the resources to start doing the kind of work, the demographic shifts in the field, and also the intellectual expansion that I think we all need, that Lynda so beautifully spoke about. And so coming here in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, and sort of thinking about what the center has done so well and where we could make, do new things, led me to start initiatives that increase the involvement of undergraduates in the research mission. And so by what we're doing are creating internships for students from Howard University, which is a historically Black university in Washington, DC. And one of the things, so coming along with teaching, coming along with research, one of the things that I think is most important if we're really talking about structural and demographic change in the field is facilitating the work of other people and facilitating entry into the discipline and our institutions for people who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented in them. And so we are bringing in people for 2 years, bringing in 6 undergraduates for 2 years, and they will be with us, and they will then move to other parts of the gallery and back to Howard in order to learn skills, create professional skills, create networks, and figure out what it is they would like to do in a field in the arts, be that in research or be it somewhere else. And I'm very excited about that. And we've gotten support from the Mellon Foundation to do this. And so but it comes back to these questions. And I think that for me, in the work and in life about we call it decolonization. We call it freeing ourselves, right? And that, in the work, it means that I've become a kind of art historian that thinks about the questions art history can ask of other things, so of looking at the world critically, of understanding the urgency of these moments. I think art history has the capacity to help us do it. And also sort of being someone with now the worldview of an art historian. And I think about where that might take us as we go forward. But again, it's really an honor to have received this accolade from the Association of Art Historians, and I thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Turner, Deputy Director at the Paul Mellon Centre, and I'm utterly delighted and honoured to introduce Professor Lisa Tickner. I first met Lisa through her writing. It was this book in particular, Modern Life and Modern Subjects, British Art in the Early 20th Century, published for the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art by Yale University Press in 2000. I think I probably read it a couple of years after its publication, when I was an undergraduate studying on the new History of Art Tripos course at the University of Cambridge and taking Duncan Robinson's module on British modernism. The book was developed from the Paul Mellon lectures that Lisa delivered in 1996 in London and then at the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven. Here's my rather dogged copy with its faded post-it notes, scribbled comments in pencil and torn fly jacket. I could get another copy, but I prefer this one with all its signs of the avid consultation of my student self. It's probably the book I go back to the most, not just for its fascinating content, much of it unearthed from archives through meticulous research, but because it's a guide to the possibilities of art's histories and art historical writing. Lisa takes on big concepts such as modernism, modernity, nation and gender with great brio. Complexity is always preserved, but somehow she manages to make sense of complex art practices and even more complicated artists in poised and pithy sentences. For me, over 20 years ago as a rookie student art historian, what particularly appealed to me was Lisa's clarion call to grapple with what is at stake in the writing of art's histories. And I'm quoting Lisa here from Modern Life and Modern Subjects. How one writes about art depends extensively on what one thinks it is and does. This, in turn, is complicated by our understanding of history, interpretation, and our own investments in the past. Art history, she reflects a little further on, is on some level an aggregate of all the often conflicting stories we have told ourselves about works of art. Words and language matter to Lisa. She chooses them carefully, both in her writing and in speech. She describes works of art to evoke their materiality, texture, and circumstances of production. It definitely tells that she trained first as an artist. But in her text, she also evokes moods, environments, art worlds, and art scenes, as demonstrated so deftly in her recent book, London's New Scene. I've got that here with me too, Art and Culture in the 1960s, published in 2020 by the Paul Mellon Centre. This attention to the stories of art is something that Kathy Courtney, the director of Artists' Lives, the National Life Stories Oral History Project, emphasised when I told her that Lisa was being honoured in this way tonight by the association, saying, and I'm quoting Kathy here, Lisa's sensitivity to nuance, to voice, and the speaking of stories, and her sense of proportion, her wit, and her humanity make her the perfect user we have dreamed of. Now in my professional life, I've worked closely with Lisa at the Paul Mellon Centre on a number of committees, doing the enriching but often very time-consuming work of reviewing manuscripts and grant applications. Her analysis is always precise and particular, but it is also unfailingly generous. She has an eye on the future, a concern for how our subject area is changing and developing, and how the real lives of those who have chosen to pursue this often precarious path is affected by what we do. For Greg Salter, one of Lisa's former students and now a lecturer at the University of Birmingham, studying with her, and I'm quoting Greg here, upended my assumptions about art history and introduced me to a subject of focus and a range of methods that continue to shape my research and teaching. It's testament to Lisa's encouragement and care that so many of her students have pursued careers in the field across academia, the museums and the museum sector. This is summed up by Eleanor Clayton, Senior Curator at the Hepworth in Wakefield. Eleanor said to me, studying under Lisa at the Courtauld was the best start for a journey into British modernism, a journey I am still on as I've had the privilege to work with modern collections at the National Trust, Tate, and now the Hepworth. Throughout her career, Lisa's work has built communities. whether that's through her path-breaking work on feminism, feminist art history, gender and difference, her career as a teacher and an educator. She's Emeritus Professor of Art History at Middlesex University, an honorary professor at the Courtauld Institute, where she taught from 2007 to 2014, or as a dedicated doer, serving on numerous committees, such as the Blue Plaques Panel of English Heritage, and as a trustee of the Art Fund from 2010 to 2020. And she was also elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2008. I wanted to include the words of others in this introduction to capture in some way the range of people who admire and have benefited from Lisa's work. She is not a showy or a gushy person, but tonight I hope she will really bask in the praise and the celebration of her work in the company of this wonderful fellowship. Lisa, over to you with enormous gratitude.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very warm and generous introduction. I think following Stephen's comments, I should book you for my obituary, no doubt in the Kentish Town newsletter. I also, of course, like all of us, want to thank the AAH for the honour of a fellowship. And also I want to thank my fellow fellows for their illustrious company, but also, of course, their work from which we've all learned so much. I became an art historian by accident. It seems that's sort of what several of us have been saying actually this evening. I left school at 16 to go to art school without A-levels. My headmaster called me into the study and explained at length how foolish I was to ruin my life so early. But there is more than one post-art school career. And my fellow students turned out to include Ray Davis, who was about to co-found the Kinks, and Kim Howells, eventually Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in Tony Blair's government. In 1968, I took the offer of a part-time job, temporarily, I thought, to support myself while embarking on what eventually became a PhD. It turns out that entirely unwittingly, my timing was impeccable. And here we move from my particular case to the broader questions of art history as both an intellectual discipline and a professional career, to the development of the AAH and the creation of Art History, the journal, the expansion of job opportunities in art education, and the absorption of art schools first into polytechnics and then into the new universities. There were, of course, cognate changes and overlapping interests elsewhere. British Film Institute conferences, screen education, history workshop journal, and also among radical groupuscules and small circulation titles of different kinds. For me, these were importantly the Women's Art History Collective in the early 1970s and Block, which I co-edited with colleagues at Middlesex from 1979 to 89. I said that I became an art historian by accident, but perhaps as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips suggests, there are no accidents, or not in that sense. In his book, Missing Out, In Praise of the Unlived Life, he suggests that the path not taken, the life not lived through choice or circumstance, stays with us, so that our lived lives risk becoming, quote, a protracted mourning for, or an endless tantrum about, the lives we were unable to live. I think of Dawn, who might have been a fruit wholesaler. Not sure I believe that, actually. But the exemptions we suffer, he says, whether forced or chosen, make us who we are, which means, of course, that it's an illusion to think that we would be the same people, but taking this other path, because if we'd taken that other path, we would be different people. Carl Jung claimed that a child's developing psychological reality is shaped by, quote, the unlived lives of the parents. My father was raised in the orphanage attached to the Cardiff Union Workhouse, and neither he nor my mother, or indeed any of their antecedents, have been to university. I might have lived their unlived lives at university. It was a bitter disappointment to them that I didn't, or at least that I didn't then. Or I might have become, or tried to become, an artist instead of accepting this timely job offer at 22. Less likely, I think. Musing on the path not taken, later, one day in my 30s, a colleague pointed out kindly, but a little tartly, you'd have been an academic doing exactly what you're doing now, but in a university English faculty instead of teaching art history in a poly. Same difference, in other words. I was never going to be on the Tesco checkout. I was never going to be a brain surgeon. This somewhere was at least the area that I was going to end up in. When I went to art school in the early 60s, art history was a newly obligatory and examinable component of the new diploma in art and design. This was what had expanded the market for the job market for art historians. Most colleges taught a survey, often known colloquially as Caves to Cairo, Anthony Cairo. This sketched the principal names, periods, and styles in the Western canon. Paleolithic cave painting as the origins of art, classical Greece and Rome, the high peaks of Renaissance Italy, selective elements of Baroque, Rococo, and French neoclassicism, 19th century realism, Impressionism, and with luck and a fair wind, early 20th century Cubism, before lectures gave way to exam revision. There was no close study of individual works, there was no time. No design history or visual culture, still largely undeveloped. Little or nothing non-Western and nothing contemporary. In 1958, the painter Alan Jones visited a famous exhibition of Jackson Pollock at the Whitechapel and said he felt like suing my teachers for not telling me what was going on in the world. This was not all art history was, of course, but a version adapted for art students and many undergraduates that nonetheless condensed strong tendencies in the English tradition towards a focus on national schools, period style, and a billiard ball model of artistic influence and reaction. You know, the cue hits one ball, it hits another ball, it goes off in another direction, and with a bit of luck, something ends up in the pocket. But I began teaching and discovered, like many others, that teaching is a demanding but extremely effective way of learning yourself, as this all began to change. From the 70s and 80s, art history was, if controversially, reshaped with the impact of a renewed interest in culture, capital, and class, by a feminist concern with women artists and the depiction of gender and sexuality, by post-colonial and then Black Atlantic studies concerned with the representation of ethnic difference and subjugation, and by the emergence of design history and visual culture. And all of these things widened the field of study beyond the objects and isms of the Western canon. This has been a collective endeavor, and one drawing insights from outside the discipline, as Lynn particularly was stressing, philosophy, sociology, psychoanalysis, semiotics, as well as from new kinds of focus within it, on curating, collecting, conservation, museum studies, the traffic in images and ideas. Art history has played an important role, I mean the journal, and continues to do so. Volume 1, number 1, March 1978, was a modest 130 pages, I think it's about 240 now, with 16 pages of black and white illustrations gathered in a single unnumbered section. There was one woman, Jane Beckett, on an editorial board of 9. All the artists discussed were European and male. This might seem unpromising, but John Irons in his editorial set out a very ambitious manifesto. He distinguishes art history from existing periodicals such as the Burlington, Apollo, and the aptly named Connoisseur. He considers the journal's prime responsibility, that of enabling the subject to grow, such that, quote, in the exploration of new fields for research, no materials, no tools, no methods, and no language will be excluded. He would encourage writers, quote, who show how a study of works of art can help us to understand more about our physiological and psychological makeup, our response to political, social, and economic pressures, our reaction to religion, philosophy, and literature, and our relations to the natural environment. 44 years later, Dorothy Price's valedictory editorial in February 2022, which is the last issue, reviews the interventions of the editorial team since her appointment in 2018. Price is the first woman of color to edit art history, and her application has, she tells us, been premised on the urgent need for the field to attend more explicitly to the discipline's white-centric past. There are now 11 women on an editorial board of 16, not quite all white. 6 out of 7 articles are by women or jointly authored by a woman in a single case, and half of the reviews, which include queer, feminist, African, and photographic topics. The AAH has not been alone in this, and the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art has also been of inestimable value, intellectually and materially, for those working or interested in British art. This means here particularly Lynn and me. But it's not parochial because it addresses, quote, all aspects of British art, architecture, and visual culture in their most diverse and international contexts. That's its brief. It supports fellowships, distributes grants, runs research seminars, a full program of public events. It has a library and archives. It publishes beautiful books and 5 issues a year of a pioneering born digital journal, British Art Studies, of which, as it turns out, Sarah Victoria Turner is the chief editor. So this takes me on to the question of the digital. Of course, art history is also available online, as many other journals now are. But in the 1990s, the digital revolution was gathering pace across art history, as it was elsewhere. In university offices, as memos gave way to email, in slide libraries, as academics scanned images into PowerPoint, in lecture rooms where Kodak carousels gave way to digital projectors, in museums who were digitizing collections, if you're lucky, in publishing where CD scans replaced hired transparencies, and on laptops, not just student laptops, where what Sam Bibby calls the JStoriography of art history was preferred to the printed page. I saw your name on the list here, Sam. Hello, Sam. COVID diminished the student experience, but digital options opened up elsewhere, or rather, they were already opening up, but they accelerated. The AAH is now part of a real life and digital landscape, inconceivable in the 70s, not just obviously technically and intellectually, but in its audience. Artist interviews, research seminars, oral histories, and websites emerge from or link to universities, museums, galleries, and special interest groups, print collectors, conservationists, fans of Victorian architecture, fans of fans. The conversations we have with works of art and with each other about how and what they mean to us extend from the lecture room and gallery to the Sunday papers, social media, and art history in the pub. By which I should perhaps explain to Stephen, I don't mean random art historians in any pub who happen to talk about their work. I mean the organization Art History in the Pub, which organizes informal seminars in pubs in regions of England. Now, this is a mixed, if largely positive outcome, but there are, of course, not grounds for complacency, some of which have been touched on. First, it's a tough time to be a student, racking up £30,000 to £40,000 worth of debt if the cost hasn't excluded you already or funneled you into accountancy or law. I got by on student grants of £6 a week. It's a tough time to be a young academic too, with temporary contracts, higher workloads, new courses to prepare, and the squeeze to be productive, which means to get something into print in the hope of securing another year's employment. But second, as Cobham Mercer put it in his fellows' comments last year, it's our responsibility as humanities scholars amid the culture wars to keep open what he calls spaces of principled dissent. That said, I've no protracted mourning for the path not taken, but gratitude for the immense good fortune of the life I have, as it were, fallen into. My unlived life or lives could well have been immeasurably worse. A large part of that good fortune is to have surfed the wave of art history's expansion into a diverse and richly stimulating field. And a large part of that in turn has been due to the AAH. So thank you, not just for the fellowship, but for that.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you all our fellows. What a pleasure it's been for the association to host you and to hear from all of you this evening. While many of us may have been aware of the accomplishments of our honorees and how they've individually and collectively moved our history forward, it's inspiring to be reminded of this through the introductions and the fellows' remarks. Their work has and continues to have a monumental impact on our field, how we think about and practice art history, the place it occupies in the broader humanities, and how it gives us new insights into the world of images and ideas that we concern ourselves with. Thank you again to everyone who's participated in our Fellows program, the nominators, the panelists, the introducers tonight, and to those of you who have joined this celebration. And congratulations once again to our Fellows. Good evening.